Good morning, I'm Saranpa, and I'm going to present to you a sample lecture of 20 minutes about the topic of legal and administrative translation. This is meant for 4th or 5th year students, and I normally wouldn't lecture for 20 minutes straight. I would vary it by assigning partner work or some individual projects depending on what we're covering. So this is kind of a compressed lecture for an introduction and a little bit of delving into some of the textual issues. So normally this would be more spread out over time, but I think we can do it in 20 minutes. All right. Good morning. Are there any questions that you'd like to start with, or any issues that you're encountering in the projects you're working on? Then let's get right to the day's topic, which is legal and administrative translation. I'd like you to take a couple, say 3 minutes with a partner and jot down challenges that you think you would encounter in legal translation, or if you have already done some legal translation, what are some of the challenges that you have come across? Go ahead and find a partner and work on that for 3 minutes. So now we've shared your ideas, and I would like to add some of my own to them. First of all, law deals with controlling human action, and it's permitting action, it's prohibiting action, it's authorizing action, and it's obliging action. And so there's a lot at stake. There's freedom at stake, for example. You're not allowed to do certain things. There's money at stake if you're suing someone over a contract issue. Even life could be at stake. If you think about treaties, and if they're not correctly translated, you could actually create misunderstanding, which could lead to war. And that's a rather extreme example, but there is a lot at stake. And in order to control human action, you might think of a structure with a roof, and you don't want the roof to leak. So loopholes and that sort of thing would allow the structure to leak. So the language you need to use to construct that roof has to be very tight. And legislators don't always get that language right the first time, so there can be amendments, or there can be longer clauses, and the language can get very convoluted. So it can be rather difficult. We also have a very wide variety of texts in the legal field, and they're organized along several different axes. For example, you have the institutional axis. What's the jurisdiction? You can have texts that are international in scope, like treaties. You can have intra-national texts, and those would be texts that involve the European Union. You can have national and provincial, county, municipal, all the way down to school district or neighborhood association texts that have bylaws or minutes or other legal or quasi-legal documents to be translated. And knowing the level you're on helps you to translate. You also have system issues. We have about 3 different systems, categories of systems in the world. One is English law, also known as common law, and that is law that's based on judicial precedent. And that's law that is the system in Great Britain, it's the system in other former colonies like the United States or Canada. And the second system is a system that's mostly used in Europe, including Finland, and that is civil law. And that is based on codes. So we have, for example, going back to Justinian and the great compilation of law that was done in Constantinople, and I think it was the 5th century, and the Napoleonic Code. We have these big codes, and so those are 2 rather different systems of law. We also have law based on religion. In the Middle East, law based on the Quran, Islamic law, or fiqh is what it's called. So this can make for interesting inconsistencies when you're trying to bring a text from one culture to another culture where the system is different. Law texts are often about something besides law. They can be about law and business, for example. They can be about law and medicine. For example, clinical trials are legal documents for which you need some medical knowledge as well. You also don't always know whether the text that you're translating is authoritative or non-authoritative. And authoritative means it will actually be used as an instrument of the law. And non-authoritative would be just for someone's information about what the legal text says. And finally, law tends to be rather cerebral. It's not like medical translation where you can kind of picture parts of the body and the processes going on. Legal translation is often very, very cerebral. So sometimes when you're working with a text, it's difficult to keep your focus at such an abstract level for so long. It's very demanding. And sometimes they get so cerebral that you forget to look at the micro level. And I just want to tell you a little anecdote about this. I was working on a very kind of high-profile case, the Julian Assange extradition proceedings, well, attempted extradition proceedings. And you know, the process is you have a translator and you have a proofreader and you have a quality management person. And I was the QM for this, and they said, we think there's something wrong. And sure enough, in this document, I believe that the sentence was, it was from Swedish to English, of course, Herr Assange kan inte infinna sig nästa vecka I rätten. So Mr. Assange cannot be present at court next week. And the translator had translated it to Mr. Assange can be present at court next week. This translator had done a very fine job of translating some very abstract, cerebral things, but when it came down to this simple issue of could he be in court or not, the translator totally failed. And this could have been it could have had horrible consequences for poor Mr. Assange. So those are some of the challenges. Now don't lose heart before we've even started, because the challenges also make legal translation a very fascinating area, and you're always learning new things. You're learning about different fields. You're learning about different kinds of law. You're learning about wills one week, and you're learning about contracts the next, unless you decide to specialize in one particular field of law. There are also a lot of parallel texts on the internet. There are good TMs, particularly helpful for defined terms, like in contracts. There are attorney associations, and I found attorneys to be very, very helpful. And there are a lot of specialized dictionaries. So we have some tools to meet these challenges. All right, we're going to shift into talking a bit about the history of legal translation, because it will help inform how people actually approach legal translation these days. I'm going to use a phrase that I hope is familiar to most of you, a Finnish phrase, and I have it up here on the screen. I'm going to bring the camera over so that you can look at it a little better. Oma maa mansikka, muu maa mustikka. I assume all of you are very familiar with that phrase. I'll get the camera back here now. And what I'm going to do is translate it in various ways to kind of illustrate what I'm going to be talking about. So the very first legal text that we still, or legal translation that we still have, is a treaty between the Egyptians and the Hittites from about 1250 BC. And this was done in a strict literal approach. And several centuries later, when we have Justinian, whom I mentioned, working on translating his code of law from Latin to Greek, strict literal approach was also used there. And let me show you what that looks like. And this would be Own country strawberry, other country blueberry. Hopefully you can see that. Now, I don't know about your English-speaking friends who don't know Finnish, but if I told my friends, own country strawberry, other country blueberry, they would probably just look at me and say, fruit. Okay. They would not understand anything. Now this is a perfectly fine translation. There are no flaws in this translation, or should I say there are no errors in this translation. But it doesn't really tell me what it means. So by the time we get to, and I'm sorry, we're really speeding through history here, by the time we get to the Middle Ages, let's look at Germany, where you have Latin law, but you have German-speaking, say, merchants coming to court, and you have scribes immediately translating the Latin into German or the German into Latin. It really became important to make things not quite so strict. Now, by this time, we have, sorry, mine went blank for a moment. Let me back up a little bit. I wanted to say one more thing about strict literal translation. And why do you think we might have had strict literal translation in the time of the Romans, or even previously in the time of the Egyptians? Anybody have a good idea about that? Who was the source of law back then? It was the rulers, right? And the rulers, what was their relationship to the divine? It was a very tight relationship. And so we have divine speech, divine laws, and if we have a translator who's going to go in there and do violence to a text by translating it, and I do think sometimes translation is violence on a text, you could have some terrible consequences. You could have a lightning bolt come down and hit you. So strict literal translation was a way of showing respect to this divine text. Now, back to the Middle Ages in Germany. By now, the practical had come more into the picture. It's very difficult to enforce laws that your subjects can't understand. And so things got a little looser. And now let's look at what this might look like in literal translation, not strict literal translation. Own country is strawberry, another country is blueberry. So we've given a little nod to syntax here. Reproducing this in English, you would generally use the verb to be. Otherwise you sound like me Tarzan, you Jane, instead of I am Tarzan, you are Jane. So by the Middle Ages, we moved a little bit in that direction. It took a few more centuries before we could get into moderately literal translation, and it was about 1907 before debates were going on about whether you could be moderately literal. And this, the prime example of that is Switzerland, when they were about to translate the Schweizerisches Zivilgesetzbuch, or the Swiss Civil Code, into French and Italian. And a man by the name of Monsieur Roussel made the point that, you know, we could translate this code into Germanic French, but does that really reflect equality? We're equal now. We really should have something in the spirit of French. So he worked and made the text sound more French, and he got a lot of flack for that. But it was accepted, and now moderately literal translation is acceptable. And so your own country is a strawberry, another's country is a blueberry. That's a little bit more comprehensible. I'm doing a little bit of interpretation. Your own country, it's not there in the original, but I'm pretty confident that is not doing a disservice to the original. Okay, I need to skip along here. So what I'd like to do now is to show you the rest of the trajectory of literalness. And I'm going to take the camera over once again. So Near idiomatic would be, your own country tastes as good as a strawberry, a foreign country tastes like a blueberry. Now, the original says nothing about taste. It's my interpretation, but I think it's getting more at this idea that your own country is better than the foreign country. Not quite there. But finally, the idiomatic translation, there's no place like home, is what really gets to the matter, although it's totally syntactically different. Because really, what you're saying with oma ma mansikka, muuma mustikka, is that your own country is as sweet as a strawberry. And strawberry is the very first fruit, and it's really, there's nothing like it in Finland. This knowledge that summer is coming and that you're going to get to eat strawberries. And blueberries okay, but they're all over the forest and they're not quite as special. So this is my interpretation. Legal translators may not do that kind of interpretation. That is too much interpretation. So really, where legal translation stops is here at most, at moderately literal. Now, really, interpretation is part of a translator's job, but in law, interpretation is the purview of a judge. And translators are not judges. Translators cannot insert their own interpretation into a text. Legal translators need to be very aware of clarity and accuracy, but above all accuracy. Accuracy trumps clarity, unfortunately. All right. So now we're going to move into an actual text, and I would like to bring up some text from the laws on citizenship in Finland. And these are from the Supreme Administrative Court, and they're available online. And let me see if I need to bring the camera over so that you can take a look. Oh dear. Here we are. So we're going to do a bit of partner work now. I'm going to give you a couple of paragraphs from this document, and this is a judicial opinion about the law. There was a case with a Russian citizen who applied for citizenship and was denied, and so this is the reasoning behind that decision. And I'm going to pass out partner work for you now. And I'd like you to focus on 4 things, and these are on the sheet. Search the following text from Finnish case law regarding citizenship and nationalization to find 2 examples of each of the following. And actually in this short excerpt you probably find 1 of each, if that many. And I want to talk first about the difference between prohibitions, permissions, authorizations, and obligations. Prohibitions, what is a prohibition? What would be an example of a prohibition? You might want to think about, in my country, we had prohibition in the 1920s, and it really failed. It was a prohibition against the use and sale of alcohol. And it means you're not allowed to do something. A permission means you are allowed to do something. But it's different from an authorization. An authorization is a special permission, a permission that is granted through a legal act or a legal document, or something needs to be done in addition to just you're doing it. You need to have some kind of action that permits you to do it. And then we have obligations. These are things that people must do. So can you, no, I don't think we're going to have time for that. I just want to make you aware of one ambiguity in the English language that you want to be careful using in your translation, and that's the word may. When you hear the word may, which of these 4 categories, prohibitions, permissions, authorizations, or obligations, do you think it fits into? It actually can fit into 3 of the 4. Prohibition would be you may not. Permission, obviously you may. Authorization, the holder of this permit may. And then obligation doesn't really work there. However, when you translate into English, I think using may can be very ambiguous, so I would watch doing that. For example, if I said, you may leave the table now, that sounds like a permission, does it not? But if I think, oh, you may leave the table, that's a conjecture. It depends on my tone of voice. And of course, in a text, we don't have a tone of voice, but and for that reason, we need to make things a little more tied together. So I think we're about out of time. Let's see what you have come up with. And here are just samples of what could have been found in here. One thing that's very interesting in Finnish is that you have this passive infinitive, on asuttava, which means must reside. And we don't have that construction in English, so you have to use a verb of obligation. All right? I think we're at 20 minutes, so thank you very much, and neke min.